All right, welcome to our week 7 History at Newcastle seminar series. We're happy to be back as usual. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the unceded lands of the Awabakal people and pay respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. So today we are very happy to welcome two people who need very little introduction for most of us. But nonetheless, I will provide that professional courtesy. We have Professor Catharine Coleborne and Dr. Effie Karageorgos, who are both co-directors of the new Center for Society, Health, and Care Research, located here at Newcastle in the School of Humanities, Creative Industries, and Social Sciences, and are both part of a discovery project funded by the ARC called Life Outside Institutions, Histories of Mental Health and Aftercare, 1900 to 1960. And it's on that topic we are happy to have them here to share a bit about their research. And so without any further ado, I will pass it off to our illustrious presenters who will share screen and begin presenting.
Brian, it's really a great pleasure and privilege to be able to present to our colleagues in this forum. So thank you very much for having us, and thanks for the introduction. I'd like to acknowledge that we're here on the lands of the Pambalong clan of the Awabakal peoples, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and any Aboriginal people with us or listening to this recording later on. And this is a photograph of one of our wonderful places here in So as Ryan has mentioned, this paper is derived from our collaborative research project funded by the Australian Research Council. And Effie and I have actually just been across to an international conference in Berlin, the European Association for the History of Health and Medical History. I can't remember the title right. I do have the bottle here from the conference, but it was a wonderful conference. It's held every 2 years in a major European city, and we organised a panel. So we're cheekily going to reprise our papers from that panel today. But what we did in that panel was also introduce an international audience to our wider project with other panel members as well. So you can see there on that first slide, the premise of our project, which is that mostly for many decades of time, from the 1960s and 70s onwards, historians were very focused on institutions, on institutional confinement and care, but leaving parts of the history of post-institutional care, or in other areas, extra institutional care, such as family provision of care, a little bit neglected. And there have been some very interesting studies that have tackled those topics. But there was a gap in Australian historiography and internationally on the topic of mental health aftercare. So that's what we're going to be talking about with our two separate papers that are woven together. And we'll be very interested in feedback from you about how those different components of our discussion do fit together in our wider research project. Now, why is this relevant? The theme of the conference was health beyond medicine. And of course, it's relevant in the present day because increasingly people fall through the cracks of organised psychiatric aftercare, such as community mental health care, and family provision of care is often not present, and we have a large crisis of mental health care in the community. So it's going to tell us a little bit more about how we did organise mental health aftercare in the past and what things may have been beneficial to people in the past that could be mobilised again in the present. So my paper is called Practising Aftercare. And what I'm going to do is set the scene, I guess, for our wider project, and then Effie will also speak to her particular case study within our joint project. And so in my paper, I want to define the historical model of mental health aftercare in Australia, and also refer briefly to the international context, very, very briefly. And I'm going to plot an Australian history of aftercare between 1907 and 1930. Our wider project runs from 1900 to 1960. I'm going to do this by talking about a profile of different aftercare organisations that we're looking at, chart their shared approaches to the provision of aftercare, and also start to identify some of the differences between these organisations, location and personnel and emphasis in the first few decades of the 20th century. And it's a little bit nuanced because it is a short paper, but they're the types of ways in which we're analysing the terrain. I want to draw attention not only to the way aftercare developed in specific parts of Australia. These are processes that point to an attenuated relationship with institutions and social expectations, but also the uneven nature of the archival collections themselves that reveal these histories. And so both of us will touch on our archival collections. In particular, using present-day private organisations' archives from Stride, New South Wales, that was formerly Aftercare New South Wales, and Casson Homes in WA, which had a longer name in the 1920s that I'll tell you in a moment. I'm going to explain the establishment and work of these organisations. So Aftercare New South Wales was established in 1907, and the Mental Patients Hospital and Aftercare and Comforts Fund in Western Australia in 1922. And it changed its name to Casson because the influence of the Casson family was so profound through the 20th century. And I think the formal name change comes around the 1950s or 60s. And I'll also touch briefly on the beginnings of the history of mental health auxiliaries in Victoria, but really that's part of the project that Effie is scoping in her work. My previous work about families and institutions briefly opened up this theme of aftercare and led me to this project with Effie. And what I did in that project, and you can see the book cover here, which is my book Madness in the Family, which has been probably one of my most kind of successful and influential publications when I think about it now. It came out of a Marsden-funded project in New Zealand, and I looked across 4 colonies up until 1914 and looked at the way families interacted with institutions. But I did, in one of the latter chapters of that book, glimpse briefly at Aftercare New South Wales. I described how ideas about aftercare and patient trial leave of absence and visitors to patients inside institutions, as well as other attempts to disrupt the boundaries between institutions and the outside world, could be interpreted as hopeful approaches to the problem of mental breakdown in the late 19th and early 20th century. They were hopeful because they signalled the ways that communities beyond institutions, or health beyond medicine, to take that theme of the conference we were just at, could create spaces for care and the support of those living with mental illness conditions. There's a bit of a kind of myth that locked institutions were locked and that was it, but people did actually come and go from institutions quite frequently, even in that time period. And yet, at the same time, some of the mechanisms for people to re-enter the community, such as the role played by official visitors or formal boards that assessed applications for patient discharge, and the worlds of the aftercare organisations themselves, as we're finding, also could act as stumbling blocks for people seeking to adjust to life outside institutions. So our new project picks up the theme of aftercare's beginnings and that hopefulness, I think, and examines mental health aftercare over that first six decades of the 20th century. And that's a really interesting periodisation because it does take in quite a lot of change in Australian social and cultural history as well as world history, 2 world wars, for example. And part of our project, through Effie's expertise, will also look at the question of the returned servicemen. Effie will talk about that. But it also takes in severe economic depression of the 1930s. But it also prefigures a world before deinstitutionalisation occurred, the massive closing down of the large institutions that housed psychiatric patients. And we might argue, I do argue, that this was a process that was happening from the beginnings of the institution themselves and from the late 19th century in particular. That closing down process was not an event, but a long-term process. So what I want to talk about is that in the early 20th century, as far as I can see now, using the archival sources that we've been examining, mental health aftercare was propelled by 3 forces. First of all, a growing concern about the stigma of hospitalisation, especially for people who wanted to re-enter society following their institutional discharge. So that they'd been discharged, recovered, and how would they re-enter the world of work and family? Second, an emerging language of care and interventions into the lives of people with mental illness. And that's an emerging language of organisations, of institutions themselves, perhaps even legislation, although we haven't looked in depth at that. And third, a landscape of increasing complexity for post-institutional care. And this reflected all of the above elements, so the stigma, but also a language of care. And it was generated in response to them. So that complexity includes things like new institutions. And writing about residential institutions in Britain from the late 18th century, historian Jane Hamlet reminds us of the existence of many different kinds of residential institution in the first half of the 20th century, pointing to the rise of an expansion of institutional apparatus, from poor relief, punishment and confinement to education and treatment of distinct institutional populations. So I argue that the Australian model for mental health aftercare combined a critique of institutions, what was wrong with them, there's the stigmatising aspect, with a diversification of institutional types, therefore multiplying the ways in which people with mental illness could access forms of care beyond institutional settings. So here I'm going to start describing each of the organisations we're focusing on in our study as examples, and then I'll talk about how these models of care unfolded. So first of all, this slide talks about those three organisations, and you can see their name there, as well as a screenshot from one of the annual reports, more recent annual reports of Stride New South Wales, which figures Emily Patterson, who was the person who really inspired the beginning of aftercare in New South Wales. Aftercare New South Wales was run by volunteers, and they established this through Emily Patterson's advocacy, established the organisation to provide practical support to people being discharged from Gladesville Hospital, one of several institutions in Sydney, in 1907. It was funded through donations, through fundraising campaigns, and from the mid-1920s, very interestingly, the Inspector General of Mental Hospitals, a government role in the state government's health division, supported the organisation by having a departmental secretary seconded to Aftercare. For its first few years, Aftercare was building its reputation, growing its community and fundraising, as well as communicating its impact in the wider community. 2 hostels for women were created in the mid to late 1920s, and over time it catered to people leaving a range of psychiatric facilities, including Callan Park and Rydalmere. So Gladesville had the strongest relationship with mental health aftercare in New South Wales from the beginning. Then we have the Mental Patients Hospital and Aftercare and Comforts Fund from 1922, later Casson Homes. And this is an image of one of their hostels. This organisation, without reading out the very long name or even going through the initials, established in 1922, was, like Aftercare New South Wales, an organisation devoted to the care and rehabilitation of people after they were discharged from hospitals. And like Aftercare New South Wales, created their own hostel accommodation in North Perth for women in need of respite care. And in the board meeting minutes, which we have access to, they commonly refer to this as a rest home. It was the work of official visitor to Claremont Hospital for the Insane, Susan Casson, and other charitable and society women, many middle-class and upper middle-class women, who mobilised the support for people leaving hospitals following psychiatric treatment. Now, it was also set up, this organisation, interestingly, in the wake of the earlier creation of several institutions in Western Australia, including Whitby Falls Hostel for convalescent cases, Green Place for women with alcohol addiction, and this is the view from Green Place, beautiful location, and Stromness for returned convalescent servicemen. These separate organisational interventions into post-institutional care had already become a solution for overcrowded mental hospitals at Claremont and Fremantle, but they were also tailored for specific patient groups and transitional care. A Royal Commission into Lunacy in 1921 made mention of these institutions in the context of new ways of managing mental illness and the possibility of triaging cases outside the larger hospitals for the insane. And alternatives to large mental hospitals were also designed to reduce stigma explicitly, as discussed in the annual report of the Western Australian Inspector General of the Insane in 1917. So as I said earlier, this move to the destigmatisation and the unfolding of the institution was beginning very early. And the mental health Auxiliaries of Victoria commenced in the 1930s and took an overarching view of the care of people who'd spent time in psychiatric institutions. They also, and this is interesting because it wasn't one organisation tied to an institution, but rather an organisation that reached into the worlds of many different institutions that were designed to house people with mental health issues. And the work of the Auxiliaries actually tried to work across all of this terrain. The archival material in this case also highlights the vital role of women in mental health advocacy, such as Edith Pardee, a foundation member for the Victorian Council of Mental Hygiene, and later an official visitor to Victoria's mental hospitals from 1937. So as we look across all of these organisations, we can see the strong roles of women as volunteers, as official visitors, as leaders, cutting their teeth in leadership and management, and doing really important work as advocates, and this is a pattern for mental health aftercare across the period. And I think also we would both argue a mark of the way aftercare developed in the Australian context. So as we go on to write this story of mental health aftercare in Australia, we can see these three forces coming together that I've mentioned. And they were circulating from the early 20th century. The concern about stigma, the emerging language of care, and increasing complexity, all the institutions that are popping up to house people who need extra care. Their emergence helps to explain what I think are some of the paradoxes here of the hidden world of caring for people in the community at a time when psychiatric illness was relatively private. So how do you manage this when people are trying to leave the stigmatising large institutions? They're finding other institutional support. So it's a sort of really interesting terrain. In its first annual report of 1907-1908, Aftercare New South Wales stated its aim as being to assist persons who've been discharged, recovered from hospital for the insane. I've mentioned the fact that Emily Patterson, who was actually the niece of Banjo Patterson, was the founder and its first honorary secretary. And she had really identified the need for combined action to aid those who were friendless, who were without money or suitable opportunities to make a fresh start in life. And you can see there on the side, I won't read those, but you can see some of the language that was used in those early reports. We have reports a little bit uneven in terms of the years of coverage, but going back to the earliest days of the organisation. There's been a little bit of work. We just met Hannah Blythe in the UK, who's written about the British Mental Health Care Aftercare Association, and there are a lot of parallels here. She's written about the focus on this development of citizenship through aftercare organisations. I really like this as well because this, by the 1920s, reminds us of the really kind of complex work that was being undertaken by aftercare, and particularly the role of the honorary secretary. So you can see here all of the ways in which that person was working to make connection with people, to help families and marriages, to find opportunities that were economic, find clothing. There's assistance for travel, for wages, employers, huge emphasis on finding employment for people beyond their institutional care. So it's a very, very interesting set of evidence that we have. And I just think this quote really sums it up by the late 1920s. The secretary, seconded from government, also took on a social work role in an era when social work was just emerging. And this is also something interesting that came up at our conference. I met somebody who'd been talking about social work as a profession and the work of almoners in hospital care as well, post-hospital care. So there's a huge emphasis on finding employment. There's an emphasis on making sure employers follow up and care for people as well as provide work for them. I just want to, I know that my 20 minutes is coming to a close, and I know that Effie probably would have warned me about that because I have got quite a lot of good material here. So I'm just going to talk to these things and then give you some case stories. At the same time as these organisations are developing their narrative, there's developing discourse in medical journals. There's not a huge amount, but we have found some stories here that point to the question of stigma, and you can see the Medical Journal of Australia in 1915 and then again in 1921, really talking about how there's a need to offer people opportunity and hope beyond institutions, because that's good not just for the person but for our wider community. So quite a lot of compassion and understanding. And this also became more widespread in terms of public commentary. You can see here a piece in the Sydney Mail, and this was largely to help support the valuable work of aftercare in New South Wales and help them do additional fundraising. What's interesting, though, is that I mentioned earlier on in my introductory part that it could also be very difficult for people to get discharged from hospital. So there's quite a lot of moralising language when people are seeking discharge from the institutions, with the official visitors in Western Australia very, very rarely recommending discharge. I've examined some visitors' books, which were the official visitors' books for the board to consult, and we see two things happening. We see the medical superintendents being very unwilling to discharge people because they might be a risk to the community or to people around them, as well as to themselves. And we also see the official visitors being unlikely to endorse a discharge. So even though there's a rhetoric here about getting out of the institution and being and facilitating these supports, that relationship between the big institutions and the aftercare was still, I think, somewhat fraught in many ways. And we've also come across in our records in the archival material, particularly from Aftercare New South Wales, cases where people might have been seen as unsuited to aftercare because they weren't coping well in the setting of aftercare or in the community. So we've seen some kind of, I guess, judgments ascribed to people in those records. So this is an example here of the minute book of the official visitors kind of talking about not really wanting, this is from a minute book in Western Australia of the Casson Homes, what became Casson Homes, talking about the type of work they're doing. So this is what our evidence looks like in many cases. And this is an example of the medical superintendent not recommending discharge in the Western Australian context. So very, very briefly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a couple of people, and then I'll finish up, Effie, and you'll have plenty of time for your part of this talk. So these are interesting stories, one from the late 1920s and then one from the early 1930s. We do have a huge amount of material and we're still finding bits and pieces that may extend these individual stories. I won't use their surnames, but you can see the differences between them. So Grace left Gladesville. She lacked family support. There was no family support whatsoever. She needed some employment support, but she had periods of physical and mental illness following her discharge from Gladesville. The records show that they were concerned about what they called an uncertain mental condition. And then over the time that Aftercare is engaging with her, they find her a bit unreliable, so she doesn't always show up for the work engagements that she's supposed to show up for. And then we see, after many, many entries, we see that she's actually been pregnant, and heartbreakingly, her child is taken away and she's returned to Gladesville. So that's a case of Aftercare in practice, not necessarily working for this particular person, perhaps because their illness, their economic conditions weren't able to be supported adequately. Contrastingly, Edna, who left Rydalmere, had been in mental hospitals all her life. She'd been thoroughly institutionalised. And when she was placed with an employer, the difference seems to be here that the employer took particular interest in her, continued to look after her, took her away with the family when they went away, so she was able to remain in that domestic employment even when they were absent. She had, therefore, consistent employment, as you can see there. The key task with Edna, as the records show, is ensuring that she's not interfered with by relatives and others because she seems to be a bit susceptible to influence. And at the end, triumphantly, in 1933, the comment is that the interference or the possibility of her relapsing has been overcome. So it seems here that the support of the employer and mental health aftercare interventions seem to have been very, very positive. So in conclusion, we're trying to investigate how exactly aftercare organisations contributed to the formation of new concepts of life outside institutions. We're finding, I think tentatively here in the final hypothesis, that these organisations were part of an evolving field of psychiatric care beyond the hospital, which is something that Hannah Blythe argued. So it's not as stark as something quite different from psychiatric hospital, but rather on a kind of plane or in a field of understanding about mental health care. And this is also patterned by these new relationships and the many little institutions that pop up and the spread of this language of care. It is a language that is infused with some moral judgments about people and their capacity, but nonetheless, we're seeing strong kind of advocacy for these individuals. This final image is just a nice segue for Effie's talk, I think, which is that we see much later on the Mental Health Auxiliaries of Victoria writing to the Western Australian group and saying, oh, hi, we're doing all this work. Maybe you'd like to be part of our kind of wider remit. And in fact, Western Australian support had been sort of going for a few more years before the Victorians had started up. So it's a really interesting and somewhat complex story that we're trying to tell. So thank you, Effie. I will pass to you.
Thanks, Kathy. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to be focusing specifically on the Mental Hospitals Auxiliary of Victoria. I might go to the next slide, but I might come back just so we can look at those images of Trelowarren and Kincora. Let's see what's going on here. Right. So there's Edith Party that Kathy was just speaking about. So she was the foundation member of the Victorian Council for Mental Hygiene, as Kathy mentioned. And in 1933, she established the Mental Health Auxiliaries of Victoria in a meeting in her own home. So initially it aimed to improve the conditions for mental hospital patients in Victoria by providing newspapers and other reading material. But it quickly grew, and branches across Victoria provided various types of support. So things like visits, food, blankets, and other goods. In 1936, the MHAV, I'm going to call it MHAV, it's just easier, established the Central Council, and then there were all these different other branches that were working with the Central Council. And in that same year, 1936, they opened Kincora, which is this image just at the bottom on the right there, which was a women's aftercare hostel. So on the 1st of June 1949, I'm going to just, I might leave it there for now. On the 1st of June 1949, 7 women, including Edith Party, associated with the MHAB, met with 7 ex-servicemen connected with the RSL. It was called then the Returned Soldiers, Sailors and Airmen's Imperial League of Australia, to discuss the establishment of a men's aftercare hostel. The 7 ex-servicemen in attendance informed the meeting that they would like to form the Trelowarren Service Auxiliary, which was going to be in the Trelowarren Executive Committee, but slightly separate, and essentially was going to work as a conduit between the RSL and the MHAB. Now, Kathy spoke about Emily Patterson and Susan Casson that had, I'm just trying to show that this is a feminine story, that women are the ones that are starting aftercare, but I'll get back to that. After years of campaigning by Edith Party and building on the success of Kincora, the government purchased Trelowarren House in Armidale in Melbourne. There's another image of it. As an aftercare hostel for mental patients. It was handed over to Edith Party on the 1st of July 1949, and they called it the Trelowarren Rehabilitation Base. Eventually it had 19 beds, 8 of those were reserved for ex-servicemen. Residents weren't given a time limit on accommodation, but government hospital patient funding was paid for only 6 weeks. So any extension would require approval by a doctor or matron. So this shows us that for funding purposes, Trelowarren was conceptualised as more clinically therapeutic than a boarding house, for example. So in this part of our paper, I'm going to be focusing on Trelowarren as one case study within the project and exploring some of the themes that we're looking at. One of these is how exactly to categorise the aftercare consumer. Do we consider them to be a patient, or do we consider them to be a citizen? Hannah Blythe, who Kathy had mentioned, we were very happy to meet in Berlin. She's discussed that in late 19th century to early 20th century Britain, individuals diagnosed with a mental illness lost various citizenship rights. During this period, the Mental Aftercare Association purposefully aligned productivity within the community, or healthy social functioning, or in other words, the ability to work, as a sign of recovery and resumption of citizenship roles. Blythe writes, quote, "Aftercare used citizenship roles as treatment." And this, of course, was gendered. In Australia, which was first invaded and settled by the British in 1788, and where the Federation of States from colonies didn't occur till 1901, working men since the colonial period have been ideally positioned as hardworking, egalitarian, fair and hardy, all qualities thought to complement the establishment of a strong nation. And Catharine Coleborne has shown that in Australia, mental health treatments from the late 19th to early 20th century aim to restore the civilised male citizen, and these were characterised by hard work and productivity. And within this framing, soldiers have been and continue to be portrayed as the hyper-masculine ideal Australian citizen. They occupy a privileged position within the nation. So for men traumatised by their military service, their less triumphant return from war saw a fall from the heights of ideal citizenry to the shame of weakness and feminisation. So sadly, this view persists. I've just sort of put up this slide quickly because this is something that I'm looking at as well. In the 2021 to 2024 Royal Commission into Defence of Veteran Suicide, you see sadly similar themes. Within this, I might not go to the next slide yet. Within this project, we've also explored different ways that the hospital and post-institutional homes have been conceptualised. Hostels in particular have been used in various forms across the world from the early 20th century, although a form of boarding out of psychiatric patients who didn't pose a danger to the community took place in Scotland from the mid-19th century, and there were similar services in the US and other countries from the turn of the 20th century. But mental health consumers have different needs, and so we can't reduce aftercare to just one service. It's a staged process where there's much crossover with the mental hospital. In the British context, the hostel has been positioned in a variety of ways, many different titles and different aims and functions, and this often depends on funding schemes or individual circumstances. So if you look at the British literature on these kinds of homes, words like hospital, hostel, ward in a house, psychiatric nursing home, and sometimes staffed group home. And some of these are within hospitals and most are outside hospitals. Now, in 1953, the report of the Expert Committee on Mental Health, the Community Mental Hospital, which was published by the World Health Organization, said that when old patients' clubs did not provide enough aftercare support, a hostel can provide temporary help to patients who, while able to return to work, are not yet sufficiently stabilised to manage their own domestic affairs, who are dependent, lonely people too sensitive to make normal contacts. I've got a longer quote there, which you can read. They recommended reconceptualising the hospital both physically and operationally as a therapeutic community, and there's a whole literature around the therapeutic community which I won't go into, and this allows for the more seamless integration into society. And this is reiterated by others. Psychiatrist Russell Barton in 1959 said that institutions cause a particular form of neurosis and advocated for an increased use of aftercare hostels within a staged approach to mental health care, which should be run therapeutically rather than custodially. Now, I bring this up just to show the place of hostels in this, that there is sort of this, there's the hospital and then there's the outside world and then there's these stages. And I show this because in 2019, the Australian federal government, their guidance has been adopted in a number of states, labelled this as stepped care and hostels being listed under level 2. So in Australia, before the broader adoption of hostels as a form of aftercare through the processes of deinstitutionalisation from the 1960s, the aftercare associations, as Cathy had mentioned, opened up their own hostels. The first was Aftercare Association of New South Wales in 1925, and then the MHAV opened Kincora in 1936, and then Trelawarren was opened in 1949. But these earlier hostels, usually in official accounts, they've been overlooked. Dolly McKinnon has said that assistance by aftercare organisations to Australian asylum patients in the early 20th century by the Red Cross and Salvation Army, among other organisations, was categorised as help rather than specific therapeutic support, undoubtedly due to their gendered reputation as women's work. So these perceptions of charity-run hostels as women's spaces, added to the view of mental illness as a weakened or feminised state, created a combative atmosphere within Trelawarren. So while we can view the involvement of the ex-servicemen of the TSA, the Trelawarren Service Auxiliary, as reflecting their interest in the wellbeing of war veterans, a clear struggle for control took place in the minutes and annual report, well, the minutes, let's say, of Trelawarren, suggesting that the presence of traumatised ex-servicemen meant that the TSA viewed the hostel as necessarily separate from the feminine context of aftercare. The TSA continually attempted to masculinise care so that these men retained their gendered position and ultimately preserve the reputation, dignity and masculinity of the Australian military forces. The TSA did also attempt to exert financial control over Trelawarren. I don't have time to go into that now, but it's a whole other story. So I'm going to focus on the sometimes very subtle shifts in the way the TSA and Trelawarren and the men living within it were defined or classified. So I'm just going to talk briefly. Marina Larson has talked about how family members campaigned the military and Australian political authorities to ensure that their traumatised relatives were placed in mental hospitals, specifically for soldiers rather than civilian, so that they would not be stigmatised. Well, they would still be stigmatised, but not stigmatised. It would be reduced. And some of the research that I've carried out in Canberra has shown that the RSL constantly passed resolutions asking for the same thing around the Second World War. So the struggle or contestation within Trello Warren based on these different conceptions of care of men, and particularly traumatised ex-servicemen, is interesting in the way it continually shifted the hostel's boundaries, moving it sometimes closer and other times further away from the hospital. So we can look at this with reference to nomenclature. Those residing within Trello Warren were usually called ex-patients in minutes, annual reports and other documents. But the specific positioning of the aftercare consumer was more than a clinical decision. It was deeply integrated with intersecting ideas about gender and citizenship. On the 10th of April 1952, it was mentioned in an executive committee meeting that one Trello Warren resident had expressed the desire to learn to drive, which was a key right and responsibility of citizenship. So Edith Party committed to finding out the exact position of patients holding motor driving licences. A note, she's used the word patient there. She reported on the 12th of May that provision was made by law to cancel licence of persons considered unfit to drive, and this was just accepted by the committee, who then moved on to other business. So we can see from this small exchange that it tells us much about where Trello Warren's, it's a tongue twister, where Trello Warren's residents were imagined by the executive committee in relation to allotted citizenship roles. The restoration of the aftercare consumer to their rightful citizenship role was assigned a particular importance when that person was also an ex-serviceman. They weren't referred to as ex-patients or patients, but ex-servicemen or returned soldiers, and so marking them as different. In monthly matrons reports, ex-servicemen were counted separately from the rest of the men, and this was a request made by the TSA. So these men had not only to be restored to their rightful place as male members of society, but to the heights of soldier citizenry, which was a privileged position. And the decisions and demands of the executive committee as a whole, but particularly the TSA, show that they were constantly aware of this responsibility within this restoration process. Now, I realise that time is ticking and I have quite a bit more to go through, so I might just quickly go through. So on the 16th of February 1953, doctors Gorman, McLean and Johnson from the government mental health clinics on Collins Street in Melbourne attended the executive monthly meeting to organise their involvement in Trello Warren's care, particularly emergency care. And they realised the need to differentiate between an emergency case and the wartime psychiatric cases. So knowledge of this responsibility, this awareness is clear. And we can also see the delicate positioning of Trello Warren's residents through the closer observation of the levels of clinical care and vocational training to be provided within its walls. Although they did seek a connection with the medical world and it was required under funding rules, the executive committee pushed back on medicalisation, seeing the hostel as a transitional stage between residents in the hospital and independence in the outside world. So a medical officer would be connected with the hostel, but would not be in residence, merely visiting weekly or fortnightly. February 1950, the visiting doctors told the executive committee they were much impressed and asked if the committee would be willing to establish a clinic here, perhaps for some EST treatment. This is electric shock therapy, now called electroconvulsive therapy. If the executive committee didn't want a clinic at Trello Warren, the doctors suggested a patient could have ECT at a hospital and return to Trello Warren on trial leave. So the doctors here are trying to narrow the separation between the hospital and the hostel, undoubtedly for their own reasons. And their mention of the patient and not the ex-patient is telling. 7 months later, it was reported that shock treatment has been given to patients at Trello Warren, and then swiftly it was decided no shock treatment be given to patients at Trello Warren. Matron to be notified, carried. So this decision suggests that at this time, the executive committee's priority was not a return to the hospital, but a move forward to a post-hospital existence for ex-patients. Now, because their time really is running out, the final part of my paper, which I will fast forward to, is the relationship between these men and work, because the TSA continually tried to introduce work into the lives of these men and show that really they were there. They were just staying there so that they could have a base at which they would work out of, and were more reluctant to admit these men were actually there for mental health care of some sort. So in 1953, a social worker, Mrs. Higgins, who was also in the executive committee, came and visited while she was in the meeting. She said, the minutes say that Mrs. Higgins gave us interesting information about the needs of patients and ex-patients, and is most anxious to establish a permanent hostel where ex-patients can live and work under supervision. Mr. Bushby, who is the head of the TSA, said that his auxiliary would be most interested in the proposal. Ms. Banchevska, on the 16th of February, so the next month, the next meeting, spoke on the question of a sheltered workshop where ex-patients could work on piecework, etc., and be self-supporting. So this idea that Trelawarren would include work as well as sending these men out to work. Sadly, a few months later, Dr. Longmire from the Rehabilitation Department at Social Services spoke about occupational therapy for the hostels, but he said the idea of the sheltered workshop, while most commendable, would have to be deferred as it was financially impracticable at the present time. And this was reflected by the fact that Trelawarren was constantly in financial deficit, undoubtedly because there was such difficulty in defining what Trelawarren actually was. So just as a bit of a conclusion, Trelawarren still exists. Well, it's not Trelawarren anymore. It's a site for mental health care. It was taken over by the Richmond Fellowship of Victoria in 1977. It's now called Wise Australia, and Party was a member of the committee of the Richmond Fellowship from 77 to 82. And I just want to also mention that today, hostels have been criticised for becoming more institutionalised, undoubtedly necessary due to lack of funding under the processes of community mental health care. And in the past decade, most Australian states which coordinate their own healthcare system conceptualise aftercare only as a crisis response, often framed as postvention and not care, specifically connected to the risk of suicide or mental health events. So, for example, the Victorian Suicide Prevention and Response Strategy of 2024 to 2034 it's the only place in government documents that mention the need for aftercare. So you can see that it's seen as this crisis response rather than something that's quite necessary for people coming out of hospital. So the state of aftercare today reflects some of the difficulties faced by the executive committee, the Trelawarren Executive Committee in the 1950s, with priorities largely set by those in charge of public funds. Thank you.
Well, excellent timing. We have plenty of time for questions, about 10 minutes plus.
I've got a question for Effie, actually.
Oh, fantastic.
We had a slide also at the end to talk about what we're going to do with this. No, don't worry, because we can do that in conversation. We can tell you what we're going to try and do. But I've got a question.
I'll pick it up.
Because I keep hearing you say things when we share our research, and I'm thinking about what we're arguing overall. Do you think that those hostels in my period, the early 20th century to 1930, do you think we could understand them in the same way as we might define hostels by 2019, which is the government document you brought up about the stepped care? Are they the same thing, or are they different because they're historically different in terms of the time period?
Well, I've been looking at recent reports about hostels. I've been reading them to see if I can compare, if I can find any sort of point of commonality. And the main criticisms are about them being institutionalized because they're owned by private entities, and those private entities see them as a money making, because I guess they need to. What will happen is that people who receive, I don't know, let's say $500 a fortnight in government funding, that basically all of their funding will go to, or almost all of it. And so these people have $50 a fortnight to live on. And the care that they're receiving in there is not good because it's understaffed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that we can compare, because it really does do the same thing in many ways, but that real thinking, it's like all this thinking happened over all of these decades about what's the best by internationally, and now we have these homes that really don't do what they're supposed to do.
Yeah.
So I think we'll definitely have to make that connection in the project because it's such a shame.
Yeah.
These hostels seem to be lifesavers for many people.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about the title of our co-authored book, Between Hospital and Home, and so that allows us, if we stick with that title, all those different little interventions that are the rest homes or hostels or whatever they are, that they kind of occupy that interesting space.
Yeah. I think let's maybe a chapter on hostels. I think that would be nice.
Right. Thanks, Effie.
Sasha has a question, and then
That was an absolutely fascinating paper. It was really, really interesting. I'm wondering. I've got a couple of questions actually, but firstly, I'm wondering whether in the literature of or the records you're seeing about these sort of halfway houses, you're seeing, or aftercare places, you're seeing any kind of reflection on the possibility that the psychiatric institutes might have in themselves been damaging places. I mean, there seemed to be a bit of a hint of it, of talking about how people have been institutionalized for a long time and they need to try and learn again, if you like, how to deal with regular life. But I'm wondering whether there's also there's any hint of that institutionalization could itself sometimes be harmful. And then perhaps this is because I work on sort of 18th and 19th century, and obviously not in Australia, but I was sort of struck by the thing that does seem to come through from sort of earlier periods really, really strongly, is this moral impetus that these buggers should be working, excuse my choice of language, right? That somehow, and certainly in the period I look at, this is a moralizing thing. Are you seeing elements of exploitation of labor in these contexts?
Good questions. Great, such great questions, Sasha. I'll just jump in the new. So I think that your first question about whether or not there's evidence in our archival materials that people saw the damaging impact of psychiatric institutions. We're having an exhibition next year, and in fact that came up with the Stride board. They asked us if we would be also looking at the sort of pre-aftercare, the larger institutional history, and we will include something because we are anticipating mental health consumers coming to our exhibition and making that connection as well as you have made it. So that's something for us to look out for. My sense is that not explicitly, but I'm looking for that in some of those medical writings and some of the popular public newspaper writings in that early period. That's where I think we might end up finding it in the later period more often. Do you think, Effie?
Yeah, perhaps. I feel like maybe, these are women who are working within a system that's run by men, and I feel like they would be reluctant to say, that's the impression I get, they would be reluctant to say that there's something wrong with this thing that they have to work with, essentially.
And actually what I sort of race through some of my evidence, but what I'm seeing a bit more as I get into the analysis of some of my records is that the aftercare arrangements are very closely tied with the psychiatric hospitals. To some extent, there's a little dialogue going on between about who's suitable for aftercare. So I think that's probably something that you see as the aftercare organisations become more mature, you see more connection with the psychiatrists. Really interesting. So that's, and then your question about exploitation. I mean, potentially. I mean, I think probably young women in my examples who are being, I think probably that first case that I read out and talked about was definitely a case of this person not necessarily being treated particularly fairly, where the second person, Edna, does seem to have a kind of supportive employer. So I reckon that probably does happen, and we'll be alert for that,
just on the exploitation, I think you've covered the first part. I'll say something about the first part. That source that I brought up, Russell, which I think I ranted to you about in the office one day, Sasha, he talks about, that's his basic view, that the institution rules, but of course this is a lot later on. A lot later on. But as far as the exploitation, no, I don't think that that's the case. And in fact, they make every attempt to try to make sure that, so for example, they hire people to work there that are ex-institutionalized men, and there doesn't seem to be any, but again, a completely different context, because if you're exploiting an ex-soldier, it's not going to look very good.
Sure.
And they do
Absolutely.
vet employers. They're quite concerned about the employers being good employers. So that's
really
interesting.
interesting. If I can just follow on that very, very briefly, that actually, particularly if they're vetting the employers of young women or women who've come through these systems, that's makes such a striking counterpoint to, say, the treatment of Indigenous, removed Indigenous children in the same sort of period.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, thank you so much. That's really worth us thinking about. Yeah.
This is not a very well thought out question, but I'm struck by the between hospital and home. What about when homes are dangerous places? You had an example of they had to demobilise the effect of the family on someone. And I'm also thinking of a thesis I read, an undergraduate thesis. And in that work, it was some records that had recently been released of a late 19th century institution. And in practice, women were being admitted to this institution because they were utterly exhausted. They had 9 children, 10 children, 11 children. They had inadequate food, they were starving, and they are literally breaking down. And she had one particular, I don't know who it was, so there was one particular case of a woman whose husband had taken her in, and she was in very, very terrible mental state. And after a large number of months, he comes and demands to have her back. The doctors say no, she's not fit to go home. Takes her back, returns at the following week. 9 months later, she has yet another baby. So, I mean, home for her was the problem. Now, where that points me to think about is what are the other institutions missing in the landscape? So is this having to pick up cases of, what would today maybe be dealt with by rape crisis, other. What is this?
Do you want to comment on
Yeah,
that?
I have something to say about that. So the Red Cross had a welfare case committee, and in the State Library of New South Wales, their records are kept, and I've gone through them, but I haven't analysed them yet. I've gone through them. There are many, many cases where women, not just ex-soldiers, but also just women, it's civilians, are appealing to them and saying that their husbands are violent. The reason why I've looked at that, of course, is because they're ex-institutionalised men who have gone home and then are violent towards the women. And largely the Red Cross, they have limitations in what they can do because they're dealing with the ex-soldier context as well. There is an attempt to remove the family, but it's not always successful. But again, I have to go through them again because it's just that one reading when I was collecting them. As far as Trella Warren is concerned, the first groundsman that they hired was an ex-institutionalised veteran who was married to a woman. He eventually had to go because he was violent towards his wife and they had to be separated. So it's there, that story is there. It will be, and it will be part of the book for sure. But there are other, the MHAV worked with so many different organisations that provided different types of care.
Yeah, and I think it'll come out most clearly in that case study of the MHAV because of the way the nature, I didn't explain it very well, but because it becomes an umbrella kind of organisation that has all these contexts, whereas the other two started off having very close alignment with individual psychiatric institutions. My early work that I flashed up there talks about the fact that the family was construed either as a problem or a solution, and that was early, really interesting. But what I think Effie's work has been showing me is that as we work through this, we can tie aftercare much more closely to an emerging dialogue about psychiatry, psychiatric care, insights into some of these issues as over the 20th century. So you're absolutely right. I think when home or family was dangerous, and clearly that the other thing I would have to say is the people so far that I'm finding in our case study of New South Wales, they're very carefully vetted. So some of the people who are accessing aftercare are are going to be a little bit more well adjusted in terms of their ability to access aftercare. So we're not seeing a lot of the other people, and I think that's the other problem. This project won't be able to tackle all of those elements, but there'll be stories we can tell. Yeah,
It's already a huge project.
Oh, terrific.
it is. It's massive.
Bigger than we ever thought.
Yeah.
All right, well, that brings us right to time, so we might thank our presenters one more. Yeah, if you have we had maybe a quick question or the coffee.
Yeah, create more work. You said at the very beginning about falling between places, falling through the gaps.
Yeah.
I mean, it does seem that the amount of service being provided is very small, and the problem must be quite large. And I was thinking of those people who do fall through the gaps. For example, men who were not returned servicemen.
Yeah, that's right.
And aged.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was wondering also whether there is a parallel or any connection with how prisoners are treated in terms of assistance given to them when they leave prison, because then they have to be rehabilitated and find employment and so on.
Oh, all good
It
questions.
was more of a general
No, all good
question.
questions, and perhaps we can talk more about it over coffee. But just quickly, we didn't say, but our project is tackling 4 major sort of demographic groups, and we can't obviously do everything, but we're looking at women as carers, we're looking at women and men as workers, we're looking at returned service men and women, and there's a 4th migrants. Yeah, so we haven't kind of gotten into that territory yet. We've got quite a lot of material to analyse. So yeah.
But I should say that in Trello Warren, it was going to be mostly non-ex-servicemen, and then what happened was the ex-servicemen didn't want to go in there because they thought it's stigmatised. It's an aftercare home, not interested, and that's a lot of it's part of the problem. And so in the end, they started letting in men who weren't ex-servicemen, but then the TSA got annoyed and said, no, we need to reserve 8 beds for the ex-servicemen, and they started paying for the beds. So anyway.
Yeah, but they're great questions. Thank you so much. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you, Kathy and Effie. Let's one more round of applause. And just a reminder, we have another speaker next week. All through week 10, we have, up until week 10, we have speakers. Dr. Andrew Park from the University of Hong Kong will be speaking to us about a career in democracy, Sarah Wamba, and the turbulent history of the plebiscite. Now, on the program, I have 2 errors. I have it listed as Friday the 17th, when it's actually Friday the 19th. There is no Friday the 17th of September. And he will only be presenting online since he is based in Hong Kong. So we'll be Zoom only in that instance. And I'll circulate a reminder on Monday per usual. So thank you all once more, and we'll see you again next week.
Thanks, Ryan. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.